Alright, so hello everyone and welcome today to another episode of The Verdict. I have kind of put this one off almost a month and a half. No particular reason. I just haven't really been making too much content towards the end of the year, but I already hit record, right? So I kind of just have to do it at this point. I did actually compile like a minor list, a decently stacked list of things I wanted to talk about. Today I'm going to be talking about Tales of Arise, which is the latest in the long-running Tales of franchise. Essentially, it's a JRPG franchise, very heavily narrative based. Usually most of these games have a lot of action oriented combat, and that's kind of the defining thing about Tales games, is that unlike, traditional RPGs like Final Fantasy and Chrono Trigger or other games where you wait for your turn to come around, Namco Bandai has taken Tales and made it into a more action-packed, more your input and your movement and other things like that directly impact your combat in the game. But before we get to that, I guess we'll just talk about Tales of Arise's story, just to get it out the way. Obviously, spoiler-free review, don't want to get into details too heavily about it, even now. I know it's been out a couple months. I like to keep my review spoiler-free as much as possible. Tales of Arise takes place in a fantasy world called Dana, and you play as Alphen, who basically is a slave. And one day, the game really pushes you directly into it. Alphen meets this weird girl by the name of Shion, and together they set out on an adventure to rid the world of the slave masters who have essentially come from space, called Renans, and to free Dana from their corruption and to essentially free everyone around the land. It's a very straightforward sort of a start. Shion herself is a Renin, which of course brings a dynamic into the group, and you're joined by 4 other characters. Your max party size is 6, which isn't the smallest, I don't think, of a Tales game. I think it ties with Xillia for the smallest. And from there on, you complete the game, you do the stuff. As with every Tales game, there's always like a part 2 to the story where you find stuff that you didn't even know, there's all the behind the scenes reveals and stuff like that. And then Tales of Arise completely shifts its tone and becomes incredibly like an old school Tales game, almost down to every single typical JRPG beat. And that's not bad, but I want to really stress that if you've played other Tales games, the opening and like the first like several dozen hours of this game does not feel like a typical Tales game. And that's both good and bad. It's good because, you get a fresh take on the franchise, you get a fresh, character and sort of, sets of locations and different things to play off of. Alphen is an amnesiac, of course, but very much so the other members of the party are not your typical JRPG characters. The plot is kind of very intentionally straightforward for the first half of the game. I hesitate to call it the half. It's more like the first 65-70% of the game, but you definitely get like a different take on it. The game is definitely way more serious in its nature. There's not as much really to joke about. There's not as much, happy-go-lucky stuff going on. A lot of these characters have seen very traumatic stuff. The enslavement of the Danans is a very, very key thing. They make it, it's not like a little side plot line, or, it's given a lot of serious attention because, it's a real serious thing in life. It's a really important thing. So usually Tales games will try to lighten the mood with skits between the characters and stuff. This game, not so much. This game is a very serious, straightforward thing, which allows it to focus on its world building and its narrative more so than trying to deliver, comedic elements to its story and other things like that. The bad part is that if that's not directly pushing the narrative forward, and if it's not directly building the world up, it just tends to be bland. It tends to make the characters not very interesting. And out of all the Tales games I played, other than maybe Grace's F, I think this game had some of the more blander characters, with a couple exceptions. Sometimes the characters really shone through, but it lacks the charm and the polish of all these other Tales games. So like if a perfect example is like in Tales games, usually when you complete a fight, a character will randomly say something at the end of the fight, and as the series progressed, this constantly evolved, with the better animations and the better characterization and the voice acting. It went from just a simple little fight completed, yeah, we're done guys, to maybe sometimes even mini skits skits being a major part of Tales games, basically the major way they flesh out characters and locations and ideas and story and everything. And they kind of have all that in other Tales games. It's almost completely absent in this game. This game takes itself super fucking seriously to a fault, in my opinion, and that's one of the things I did not like about this game when playing it, was that the game is way too hard and way too serious about its subject matter. Sometimes it works, you know, there's always a balance that needs to be struck between keeping your plotline serious and knowing when to develop it, but also knowing, especially, like, Tales games are not like Gears of War, and I apologize for this. I didn't even know the window was open. But Tales games are not like Gears of War. They're not like Tom Clancy games, you know? And there's a certain degree of, like, playfulness with the characters and the world and the ideas being expressed that's always kind of really interesting to see get actually fleshed out in the course of a Tales game. By the end of the game, you know, it was pretty bland. Like, nothing was really developed. There wasn't really much chemistry between a lot of the characters except for some love plot lines, which is okay. It just feels empty. It feels like when combat ends, instead of getting, you know, a little bit of a flashy scene showing off a character, you know, like, let's say a character's a badass, so maybe he'll flex his muscles and say, yeah, I'm the strongest or something. You don't get that. When combat ends in Tales of Arise, you just go back to the overworld. You know, they don't really say anything. There's no, like, there's no flair, there's nothing. So maybe you want a super serious JRPG. For me, I kind of felt that made the game very empty. You know, the characters are just kind of there. This, of course, being their first game, you know, they had a brand new engine for this game. They got a whole bunch of different changes. And while the world is kind of massive, it's also very linear. You know, you're not going to really be exploring this game. There's never really been a JRPG, I feel, other than the first half of Final Fantasy 15, where you, like, fully explore an open world in a JRPG sort of combat style. Now, one thing that Tales of Arise does do really well in its gameplay, since I've sort of shifted over to gameplay, is Tales of Arise takes the environmental combat of Tales of Zestiria, and like Tales of Berseria, it makes sure that each area, you know, each arena is essentially like a circle or a box, depending on the room. But you're never going to, like, be stuck in such a way that you can't see what's going on. Or, you know, the claustrophobia is not there, which is nice. I like that. The other, probably the best thing this game does with its combat is that Tales of Arise allows you to have full-on midair combat. Now, in most Tales games, you can jump, and what jumping does is, obviously, it lets you maybe dodge an attack that's low to the ground. It changes your moves, what moves you can use in the air, and maybe allows you to combo off of some of them. But in every Tales game, and I cannot stress this enough, every Tales game that I have played, other than Berseria, has height as one of its things that you could do, and it always feels weird because you are affected by gravity the instant your upward velocity stops. I mean, that's, you know, that's realistic. But the problem with that is that means that you can't combo in the air. So jumping doesn't really give you anything in most other Tales games. Now, there might be some niche strats or something you could do with it, but you don't really gain anything by going in the air other than a lack of mobility. You know, you have to fall back down. You can't move in the air really most of the time. And I would say this is the worst aspect of almost any Tales combat, because pretty much it doesn't need to exist. And Berseria, in my opinion, which, full disclosure, I played Berseria right before this game came out. I delayed it 4 years. I know, shoot me, please. Berseria opted to not have a jump button at all. And I personally felt that made the combat of that game, like, basically shoot to the moon, because now you have a button that's completely freed from having to do jumping and all this weird stuff. Well, Arise turns around and has some of the best midair combat I've seen in a game in a while. So when you attack in the air, what happens is you will you'll hover in the air. You'll finish your attack string. Every character can execute so many attacks in midair, which is kind of cool. And you could use arts in the air. There's a certain set list of arts for your melee characters that are usable in the air. By the way, similar disclosure to every Tales game, I would only ever play as the main character if I were you. Maybe there's another character in there that you could play as. But in Arise especially, you should probably just play as Alphen the whole game. I could not imagine playing as someone else. The AI is not very smart. They will not really dodge out of stuff. Occasionally, they'll show like a spark of really good intelligence. They'll see an attack coming and they'll roll out of it because, yes, this game does have rolling, which allows you to dodge out the way of an attack, which is a great thing and a great addition. But most of the time, the negative about that system is that the AI doesn't really use it. The AI will just sit in attacks and take it. Especially, there's a couple boss fights where essentially the boss does a big AoE in the center of the room, and they'll just stand in it. They won't even try to get out of it. And it's like, well, what can you really do about that? You know, you can't give up control of Alphen because then the AI will force him to run in and attack the boss. You know, there's not really anything you could do. And that leads into one of the big problems I'll talk about later. But yeah, you have a set list of arts that you could use for your characters, which is cool, especially some in midair, which is awesome. I think that really adds, you know, a layer of depth to this gameplay. You're allowed to do big combos. The Mystic Art system returns in this game. However, the Mystic Art system is good in this game in triggering your higher level Mystic Arts, but when you go into when you go into Overlimit, which is what allows you to use your Mystic Arts, is completely random and determined by a hidden counter. It's the same system from Symphonia that I did not like, which is why in Symphonia, it pretty much is a system that you could ignore and beat the game no problem. Now, Symphonia is a much easier game than this. It's a much easier game for multiple reasons. So it's a different story when I say that the Mystic Arts, although they're easier to execute, you kind of need them in this game to deal big damage to bosses. Unless you want to run out of items, or unless you're really, you know, over leveled or have a good strategy. If you're just face checking these bosses like normal, you're going to encounter a lot of difficulty when it comes to some of these bosses because they decided to make Mystic Arts, your most powerful attack, completely generated off of random hit amounts. And I don't know, maybe you could count the hits, you know, maybe it's some calculation of how much damage you're taking, how long it's been since your last overlimit. I don't know the mechanics, which again is part of my point, but the biggest problem I have with that is that if you want to time your Mystic Art, most people will save up their Mystic Art, you know, they'll fight a fight and they'll say, okay, I got it, I'm going to use it for the boss, right? I'm going to use it so I know I can use it for the boss and deal big damage, which is a good thing, right? Like, you want to save your strongest attacks for your strongest foes. That's any game ever. You could just get your overlimit randomly when fighting normal enemies. And the way you get it back is to get hit, basically. So, like, you're not saying you're not going to get it during a boss fight, but you're going to get your overlimit in a random encounter, and then it's either use it there or lose it. Which is nice, but, you know, you're not here to test yourself on random encounters. The random encounters are not normally the ones that are going to kick your ass. So that's a system I don't really like. I think that was bad in Symphonia, and almost no other game since then that I could think of does a system like that. But whatever. Okay, sure. So the rolling, I will go back to this. Rolling is a great addition to the game. What it does is it allows you with perfect timing to, with normal timing, you could just dodge an attack. You could still maybe be hit by it if the attack is wide or if your dodge didn't go the correct way. But if you perfect dodge in this game, what happens is that time slows down. This is a single player game, by the way. There's no multiplayer I think for a First and Tales games. But anyway, I've never played this game on multiplayer. I think once I played Symphonia with some friends. It was not that great. With perfect timing, you could dodge an attack. It's really it's like any other game that has this. Time will slow down, and you're basically given the opportunity to parry and deal damage back to an enemy that you just attacked. So an attack comes in, you dodge it perfectly. You know, there's a glimmering effect that comes around your character, and you could press R1 and you could get a big hit in for some damage. Now, this is a great system in like almost most games it's in, but this is one of my biggest problems with the game, and I know that this is like, whatever, I complained about it nonstop in the playthrough. Enemies, and especially bosses, do not readily stagger. So what I mean by that is in most games like this, if you hit an enemy enough times, you could play Dark Souls, you could play other Tales games, you know, you could play other games in general. If you hit an enemy enough times, what will happen is that they will take a moment and they will be staggered and they will fall to the ground or they'll do something else, and then you can capitalize on that, right? That's like a standard thing in most games, is that you get an opportunity to attack and to do something, right? Okay, fine. Tales of Arise has a system like that. The problem is that enemies will stay staggered for such a small amount of time that you will not be able to even unleash one art on it. You know, you would think that's the perfect time to unleash my Mystic Art or something like that. You will not be able to do that in the small amount of time on most of these bosses. So what will happen is that some bosses are just so big. This is the comical dichotomy of the bosses in this game. I find that most bosses either completely fuck you or are too big to actually hit you and do anything meaningful. And to me, you know, it seems like it's inconsistent how hard the game wants to be. The bosses that are too big to hit you and are just easy. There's not really anything to say about them. You just hit them like fucking piñatas until they die. But on the other hand, the bosses that are small, more agile and stuff, they could just dodge around your attacks. Okay, you hit them with a perfect dodge parry. You think maybe that'd stun them for a second so you could get in another hit or two? No, they just keep going. But when you get hit, you get stun locked. Oh, definitely. Oh, 100%. You get stun locked. Don't get it twisted. But for them, you know, they figure it out. You know what I mean? And I think that over the course of the game, almost nothing pissed me off more than playing against someone. And over time, you know, you're fighting against a boss and you try to go in for a big attack. You know, your arts take time to execute. You know, Alphen has a multi-hit art that's really good, but you can't really use it because most bosses will recover from stagger in like 3 seconds. It's like a 5 to 6 second art, and you know, to unleash your mystic arts, you need to chain together arts to get the better, you know, to get bigger multiplier, bigger damage. You can't even do that. The boss is already attacking you again. So like, yeah, you could be an over limit, which means you don't stagger. That's the one time you're pretty much immune to it. But then you're gonna take a lot of damage and you could potentially die in over limit from having to face tank their attacks. And so to me, like, the bosses are just too much like Dark Souls enemies in my opinion. And the gameplay mechanics are of a Tales game. You know, you're bound by certain restrictions. You can't just free roll and do whatever, and you're not dealing tons of big damage. These fights feel like they're always on hard mode. And as much as I like a challenge in some of these games, I would tell you most Tales games are kind of solved formulas for the most part. I feel like making the bosses like ridiculous tanks was not the way to go. They try to throw in like weird MMO mechanics, like there's an aggro system in the game, but it's never represented in actual gameplay. It's just on items that you can get. You could force enemies to focus on you and then force them to do things to Alphen. But there's no real tanks in this game on normal difficulty. Even the two bulkiest members of your party go down in like 2 to 3 hits. And that is another thing about the game, is that most enemies in this game will deal ridiculous damage to your party. I had the best gear on them, some of the best upgrades, and it still felt like they were just getting railroaded, you know, sometimes by normal enemies, but especially by the bosses. And what good is having a tanky party member if they die in 3 hits? You know, it's like, again, am I playing a Souls game or am I playing a Tales game, you know? And I get they don't, you know, I'm not saying they gotta take 10 hits, 20 hits before healing or something, but then they're not tanking. So then this aggro system, you could play the whole game and just ignore it. It doesn't mean anything. And that's ultimately what I did. I said, okay, well, it doesn't matter anyway. Now, a good thing I like about this game is something that they've done in a couple Tales games so far, is that every character has a unique ability that they could do. So Alphen's unique ability is that he can take his sword and he can hold it and he could deal big damage with it at the cost of health. So he could sacrifice, you know, 50% of his health bar or something to change the move's effect after executing the base art, and that will deal a lot more damage. It's its own separate move. You're going to use it the whole game. Again, it runs into the same problem of, okay, well, the boss just dodges out of it, or oh, the enemy's too fast. Same problem exists, but whatever. Now, there are midair versions of all these different moves, which is cool. Another one of your party members can throw bombs and detonate them after arts and stuff. Another party member has like a dodge attack that allows him to get extra range and faster speed, which is cool. And it's nice that every character has something to them. Another thing that I also like are the burst attacks. So during combat, you are able to tell your character you're playing as, or any of your party members, including the ones in reserve, that you want them to execute their special move. So for instance, your mage, if there's any spellcasters on the field, if you see them casting a spell, you could summon in your mage. Your mage has spell steal as her special ability. That immediately staggers anyone casting a spell. And pretty much that's the one you're going to use the whole game. There's another one where your shield tank member can run out, plant her shield in the ground, and then soak up a hit and stagger someone who's charging. Now, this is hit or miss. It's really weird how it works. They don't always run into it correctly, but it's a thing, right? It's a start. Another one of your party members can bind enemies that move quickly. Some enemies have innate dodge chances. They'll just step out of your attacks when you hit them, so you bind them with vines and they can't do that. You know, it's all sorts of things like that. One of your party members is good against shooting down flying monsters. And it kind of is a better replacement to the system that was in Graces and Berseria, which is that certain attacks are good against certain monsters. But it's also kind of bad because they want you to use these, like, if you're not fighting a certain type of enemy, these moves are almost worthless, I've found. They're almost useless. Now, lucky for the mage, most characters in this game, or most enemies in this game, cast some sort of spell, especially towards the end game. There's too many spells for her to steal. You're not going to be able to steal them all. But at least, you know, she's in constant use stealing spells for you. Some of your party members, you're just not going to use their ability. Like half the time, like I found that the one of my party members is a monk. You know, his ability is to break armor. I found myself just throwing it out there because when you do it, you get back souls. And basically the way souls work, to bridge into that, is that when you attack in this game, you have a set attack limit for your normal attack. They brought back normal attacks. They've been absent since Zisteria, and they're absent sometimes. You have normal attacks in this game, and basically it's like any other game. You can attack so many times in a combo. Once you're done, you have a reset period before you can do anything else. So what you do is you extend your combo limit by using arts. Arts are special abilities. You know, they're your typical Tales spells and melee abilities. This is in like every Tales game at this point. And so, for instance, you could extend it by using arts. Arts cost a certain amount of souls. It's almost the same system as Berseria. When you use an art, it takes away from your maximum soul gauge. And then once you hit 0, or once the next art you want to use costs more than what you have, the game says, no, you're done, you can't use any. And it's displayed at all times in your character's health bar, which is kind of neat. And yeah, it's not necessarily a bad system. In fact, I think it's better than Tales of Berseria's. This might be one of the few things I like about this game over Berseria, is that you don't need to mandatorily stop and guard for like 3 or 4 seconds to get your souls back to continue attacking in this game. And unlike Tales of Berseria, where you only really increase your soul gauge by constantly grinding and finding materials and reinforcing your equipment, in this game, instead, you get it just by leveling up your characters and by increasing their skill list. I'll get to that in a minute. So the soul system is fine. You know, it takes away, it's pretty good. Now, again, the biggest problem I have comes from the fact that you can't really ever get a chance to unload on enemies, you know. And even when, like, at the start of the game, all your abilities cost 1 soul, and then you get a couple 2 soul abilities, and it's like, okay, well, that depletes my stuff. By the end of the game, you're going to want to use a lot of 2 souls because they're good, but, you know, you want to hit as hard as you can with as little openings as you can get. The way you level up in this game is pretty typical to a lot of RPGs. Every character has a list. In this game, there are no titles like older Tales games. The titles in this game are on your skill list. So as you progress through the game or complete side quests or do optional things pertaining to these characters, they gain titles like any other Tales game. But basically, it's just a fancy way of saying they gain nodes. and you can upgrade things on that node. There's usually 5 points per node, and sometimes it's a new art, sometimes it's like a boost to stats. When you complete a node, you get a overall boost to a stat that, you know, they tell you about, like, okay, this node is attack plus 50 when I complete it, and stuff. Very, very simple stuff. You've seen it before in at least like 3 other games, like Final Fantasy 12 or something, and Tales of Exilia. And so the leveling up is fine, but if I had to say, out of all the stuff I've talked about, the biggest problem I have with this game is the income. The income system of this game is shit. It is awful. It is dog shit. So let me explain. The way that every other JRPG works on the planet that I could think of is that when you complete a mission, or when you complete a fight, or when you complete anything, right? Usually random encounters, bosses, whatever, you name it. You get some items as loot, and what do you get most of all? You get money. You get currency. You get some amount of guild or gold or gold or whatever to fund whatever you want to get. And that's why grinding in most JRPGs is a twofold endeavor. It's 1, to get experience to level up, and 2, to get money to buy the things you need to buy. And that is like universal even outside of JRPGs, like even outside of the realm of Tales and Final Fantasy. For some indescribable reason, when they made this game, they said, okay, we're not going to give you money from random encounters. I don't understand why. It fucks over the entirety of the game, especially the late game. As I said before, your teammates will run into attacks. They will not always dodge properly, right? Because they can't dodge everything, because then the whole game is too easy, right? But so you need, teammates got to get hit. Like, they got to mess up, and you know, whatever's got to happen, fine. But not only do they have the typical Tales limit of 15 items, you know, per item, which probably you could increase on New Game Plus as always. But they also make it so items are incredibly expensive, exceptionally expensive. So if you, okay, the apple gel is like 400 gold, fine. The orange gel, which is what dictates, you know, how often your teammates can heal, because healing is a pooled resource in this game, costs 3,000 gold. Money is not falling from the heavens in this game. So the best way I found to make money in this game is to essentially sell raw materials. And you might say, oh, well, clearly they must give you a lot of raw material. No, they don't. If you're just playing through the game, they do not give you enough raw materials to facilitate you just buying your way through most of these cutscenes and most of these fights. They don't do that. They don't give you enough money to do that. They don't give you enough gold to pay for orange gels, grape gels, life bottles, you know, all the essentials that you need, all the high-level materials you need. Lemon gels for healing are expensive as hell. You know, we're talking things that cost thousands of dollars for, or thousands of gold for one use. One use. One use. It costs that much. And to me, what that says is that they are like, it means that the system wants you to grind. They want you to go out and to fight a bunch of enemies nonstop, endlessly. And one thing that I found out, and this definitely influenced how I thought about this, is that you could buy gold using real money. You could go on the PlayStation Store, presumably the Xbox Store, I don't own it on the Xbox, or you could go on the Steam page and you could buy essentially money DLC for the game. You know, there's a ton of DLC for this game. There's Sword Art collaborations, there's tons of DLC for this game. And what that absolutely says to me is that this game that is so founded on microtransactions, it's like borderline unplayable on higher difficulties, unless you are just resolved to just sit there and grind until you get what you want. And for me personally, that's not a good thing at all. I think that the money system in this game is the biggest limitation, because you could put up with all the other stuff as long as, you know, reasonably you could go out, you could go buy some items, and you could, you know, prepare for the next fight, you know, figure out things. And that would actually help the game, because by doing that, you could ensure that the player has a comfortable amount of items and resources, so when they encounter a mechanic in a fight that's fucking stupid, they can actually beat it. You know, they could recover, they could revive some teammates. No, and a lot of times in this game, a lot of fights came down to the wire. And ultimately, what happened was is that I got to the end of the game, and there is essentially like a gauntlet they want you to go through at the end of the game. And the gauntlet that they want you to go through at the end of the game is basically to fight 6 superpowered bosses. Most of these are you've already fought. They're just normal enemies thrown at you again, you know, in ridiculous fashion. And there's no fast travel point. So if you want to come back and get items, you know, this is like old school RPG stuff that RPG stopped doing years ago because it was so obnoxious and not fun. And so they basically made it so you would have to leave, grind, get money, get everything, come back, fight one, leave, grind, get money, come back, fight one, you know. And levels are always good, but it's not like, they're not really changing much. I mean, like, you could also buy levels as well, which is another sus thing I found, is that like it almost feels like you're supposed to hit a wall at some point in this game and then take a look at the cash shop to see if you could get by. And ultimately I said to myself, I said on the playthrough, I could either sit here for 10 hours at the literal end of the game and grind and get money, and I had to grind throughout parts of this game. I'm not buying fucking money. That's the whole point. They want you to buy money. They want you to hit that wall. That's intentional bad game design to sell more microtransactions. So in multiple times in this playthrough, I sat down, I had to grind. You know, it's okay, you learn a little more about the game. Grinding is not always a bad thing. I actually like grinding in reason. Sometimes it allows you to, you know, mess around, learn new things about your abilities and teammates. You know, it's basically like free time, you know, to do whatever and experiment. And I like that in games because, you know, you could do whatever. But when it becomes a necessity for you to comfortably beat the game, I said no. I'm just gonna beat the game. And I turned the difficulty down. So if you want to complete this game on normal, I'm gonna let you know right now, you're gonna have an incredible amount of time spent doing this. And the only other things really to talk about are, like I said earlier, healing is a pooled ability. So like I said, arts cost souls. This includes your casters. Most Tales games have either completely foregone all of this, or they, you know, the old school games require you to use orange shells to power up your mages, you know, keep their MP high, and they could cast spells. I mean, it worked for everyone too. Even martial arts took TP. But you know what I mean? Like, you have to keep people's TP high, you know, so that way they can continue to use arts and abilities. And what you would do is you would passively regenerate it, you know, just by fighting or doing other stuff. And, you know, every game handles the MP quandary differently. Some games choose to ignore it. Some games go very heavily into it. Tales of Arise errs on the side of what the fuck and decides to pool all of your healing abilities into one big pool. And what happens is that as you use those abilities, like let's say revive, heal, bigger heal, area heal, remove ailment, you know, things like that, you draw from this pool. And eventually, you know, when this pool gets low, you can no longer use those moves. You know, it's like a global mana pool in the game. And there's ways to increase it, but you only increase it by increments of like 10, you know, and generally leveling up also increases it, which is fine. But the biggest thing about it is that if you want to do it, like let's say you're in a dungeon or you're out and about, remember, orange shells cost a lot of money. Orange gels and all the other gels, I don't remember all the different flavors, cost a lot of money or are rare. So every time you refuel it, you're basically dumping like 3,000 gold just for another couple of usages of heal. And remember, in these fights, you're going to be taking a lot of damage. You know, teammates are going to be getting downed for just one random reason or after another, or even, you know, unless you're playing perfectly, you're going to get down sometimes. It just, one simple decision cascades the entire game down. And I kind of feel like the money system in this game is what really absolutely draws this game, not necessarily to a standstill, but it definitely lowers it down way more than it should have been. What should have happened is that this game should have focused way more on, okay, well, how do we keep a money system that's favorable to the player? And really, ultimately, it comes down to just don't price the items so goddamn high, right? Like, what was the point of pricing these items like at some ridiculous amount? I don't know. I genuinely don't know. Anyway, what I will say is that the game performs pretty okay on PS5. That's what I played it on. I don't really have like so much terrible stuff to say about, you know, graphical and everything. As I said, the presentation of this game is way more serious than other Tales games, which might be one of the things I kind of am not a super huge fan of. You don't have the nice little portraits on the bottom of the screen that change as your character fights and takes damage and gets KO'd and does other stuff. That's all gone. You just get boring health bars now, and a name above it. That's it. That's what you get. It really feels just bland. It feels like a boring, typical game, which is very much in contrast to the last part of the game, where it really feels like a full-on Tales game at the actual end of the game. Now, that said, some of the characters are cool. Most of them are bland half the time. You know, you pretty much, I feel like we ran in circles around the same couple of plot points, dealing about things like racism and finding reasons to live and do things. I feel like we definitely ran in circles around that. You could argue that's the JRPG genre. I feel this game definitely overdid the same issues over and over, but I get it, it's part of the genre. I feel that this game could have maybe even benefited from having 8 party members, more party members, you know, maybe more healing and more things going on, right? Maybe the healing quandary would be a little better if you had 8 people contributing to this global mana pool. I think that the money system should have been fixed about this game, or items should have cost less, meaning that you have to grind less. But I really just feel like they should have just given you money at the end of every fight. I feel like that, like, all these other ways are like band-aid fixes around the general notion that you need to then go take these items you got from these monsters and sell them. And let me tell you, like, you're not gaining a ton of experience off of these monsters when you're grinding like this. The game is basically telling you, you're a really good level for this area. We're not giving you any more experience. So you could go fight the boss. And then you go fight the boss, you get stun locked to death, you get staggered, the boss doesn't stagger, random mystic art doesn't help you, missing arts because the boss is too fast. You know, it's a whole quandary of problems that just sort of arise. And the best way I could talk about this is I could go back to the game I just played this year, which is Tales of Berseria. Tales of Berseria is a great game. Great protagonist, lots of soul in the artwork and the skits, and tons of skits and dialogue. You know, great prequel to Zestiria, lots of good stuff about it. But the biggest thing I could say about the combat is that, one, because they removed jumping, they could focus on having a diverse combat. Yeah, it feels a little empty at the beginning of the game, but by the end, you know, I felt like I had really developed a lot of different combos that I could do and different things and everything. You know, I felt like every combat encounter was rewarding. Yeah, they're challenging. You know, some of them, especially at the end of the game, I started skipping some fights, but that was really only at the end of the game. You know, throughout the entire game, I didn't want to just skip fights. I wanted to fight because it was fun, because all the moves felt cool, and having your party members work together was awesome. And that, to me, is exactly what Tales should exemplify. You know, you have this active time battle. They call it they give it some weird name. It's like the linear combat motion system. I never learned them. It's all kind of basically the same thing. It's marketing, and it's really cool. It's fun. It's great. Play into that. But you also got to reward players for wanting to do that. Like, you want to say to people, combat matters, because otherwise, you know, you don't want to just say, okay, well, you fight, but you don't get anything from it, and now you've blown thousands of gil on resources. And by the way, you could fix it by taking your credit card and buying some money. You know, buying 400,000 gold, which will coast you through the game. Not really, but that's what they don't want you to know. And I just think that could have been done better. Now, despite all of this, my reviews might be my score might be a little bit different than what I think I might have insinuated throughout this. I'm going to give Tales of Arise an 82 out of 100. And the reason I'm going to do that is that the money problems definitely, like, take off like a ton of points. I think that's probably the most. Then you got a couple points here and there for the presentation. Like, you know, just, it feels bland. It feels boring. It feels like if you took Tales off of this, like, yeah, it would look like a Tales game, but it wouldn't feel like a Tales game. You know what I mean? Like, Tales is a distinct style in the same way Final Fantasy has a distinct style, you know? When you're playing a Final Fantasy game, in the same way, when you're playing a Fire Emblem game, in the same way, when you're playing like a COD game or something, when you're playing a game of a certain franchise. Especially if you're a longtime fan, it is something that you just inherently know. Like, you don't need to be told. When you're a fan of a franchise, when you're playing a game of that. by getting rid of all the skits, you know, the animation, which they spent years refining skits and everything to be more fleshed out, and, you know, full voice acting was a big deal in Vesperia when it happened. It feels just sad to see that they brought none of it back. The skits now in this game are boring and bland 3D model viewers. You know, like, there's a couple of cool skits, I guess. There's one point where one of the characters does the Eddie Murphy thinking meme, but but that's my Discord picture. But other than that, like, I feel like there's not really, like, soul in this game. It feels bland and empty most of the time when it's not either being really badass or having a really cool moment. You know, there's a lot of fluctuation, and then most of the cool moments are usually preceding or following an incredibly annoying boss fight. But I will still say that this game was a fun experience. I definitely would at least try it later when it's cheaper, if not buy it. It definitely offers a lot of gameplay and a lot of fun. Now, like I said, not the best, but it was still satisfactory, and I still felt that even having to lower the difficulty at the end just to avoid an unnecessary, you know, 10-hour grind possibly, I still enjoyed myself. I still thought that, well, you know what? It was a wholesome end. It was kind of fulfilling. There's some cool stuff that happens. The gameplay, but believe it or not, if you play this game on easy, it's actually like the easiest Tales game ever. But if you play it on normal, it's like harder than every other Tales game ever too. It makes no sense to me. It feels like scales are messed up in this game. But I still think it's a fun experience, and I still enjoyed playing it. There's definitely a lot of good between the Midair Combat, I think, is really good. When the systems are working, they're really good, you know, and that's what I actually said, is that in this game in particular, more so than any other Tales game, the bosses suck, but the random encounters are actually kind of fun. You know, the random encounters, you know, between the enemies having different weak points and stuff are actually kind of fun. And I actually really like it, and I really enjoyed having these random encounters where, you know, okay, well, this enemy has to go first, and then this enemy has to go there. It's cool stuff, and I like it. But the bosses need a lot of work, the money system needs a lot of work, and they need to bring back more Tales-style presentations. But with that, I think I've fulfilled my verdict super late. Thank you for listening. It was a good playthrough. I enjoyed playing it. I'm looking forward to the next Tales game as always, because, you know, it's still worth the time. I still enjoyed it. I still think just Berseria was better though. But in any event, I am going to go do something else now. So thank you very much for watching The Verdict. I am Sparian Pro 1000, and I will see you later.